All right, so Edgar Allan Poe is the subject of our discussion for the next 2 days. Today is the Black Cat and the Imp of the Perverse. I think next Tuesday is, I think we're doing Fall of the House of Usher, and I think Lygia might be the other one we're doing. I'd have to double check. So we're getting several classic stories from him. Even just these four that I've picked, there's so many more we could do. Right? He wrote so many good gothic stories. Of course, all of you probably know the Telltale Heart from middle school, high school. Have all of you read the Telltale Heart before? Yeah, Lauren and Ryan, you read it.
I'm sure I've read it, but I don't remember it.
It's the story about the guy who murders another guy. Then he hears his heart underneath the floorboard.
I have 100% read and watched videos about it.
Yeah, that's his most sort of iconic story, mostly because of just the fact that it's written in a relatively simple way. So lots of times it's told, and I think I read it in middle school, which is interesting. So yeah, he is amongst one of our most iconic writers in the American literature tradition. He's definitely the iconic writer within the Gothic tradition. He and Nathaniel Hawthorne were both the most influential Gothic writers in early America before the Civil War. Both of those guys were at the peak. We'll read some Nathaniel Hawthorne next Thursday, a week from now. So both very different styles, as we will see. So what do we know about Edgar Allan Poe? What to say about him? Of course, I will instead of me lecturing, I will defer that to you guys. What do you guys know about Edgar Allan Poe, the man? What the myth, the legend, right? What do you guys know about him as an author?
He was an alcoholic in
Right.
his life. Definitely some mental health problems. He lived in America. But was he from America originally, or did he come over here from another country?
Yeah, he was from America. He went to he was from Virginia. He went to West Point at first, and then he got kicked out. Then he went to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, which isn't too far from here. He failed out there, so yeah, he's from his museum now is in Richmond. So I think he lived pretty close to the Richmond area. I might be wrong about that, but that I do know that's where his museum is.
Didn't he also live in Maryland? Because aren't the Baltimore Ravens named after him?
Yeah, Baltimore Ravens, right? He worked in Baltimore, yeah, as an editor of these different literary magazines. Yeah, so yeah, a lot of different places try to hold claim to Poe. Of course, that Richmond, Baltimore, D.C., those are pretty relatively close to each other places. I think Baltimore is only an hour from D.C. or something like that. Richmond's a little. I think Richmond's like 90 miles from D.C. or something like that. So yeah, that area, Virginia, Maryland, that's who lays claim to him. So yeah, Nicole, you brought it up. He does most of the times when people think about him, they think about the troubled writer. Right? He was depressed. He maybe had mental health issues, alcohol issues as well. So that's interesting because that's part of what this Black Cat story is about, right? Is the temperance issue, which we will talk about. Yeah, he was one of their very first writers. Irving did so to an extent, but Irving was also a diplomat. So he made a career out of being a diplomat as well. Poe was one of our first writers ever to make a living off of just being a writer. Before that, in literature, most writers also had another job. You couldn't pay the bills just by writing. And it was mostly a leisure activity, something people did for fun. And then if you became famous that way, great. But for the most part, some writers in England did before America. But as far as America goes, Poe was probably one of the first to actually make a living off of doing just this. So he edited all these different magazines that published all these stories. He had a very wide readership for his day. He's an interesting story because if you would have taken this class, if you would have taken a class in, let's say, 1930, he wasn't as popular then. Like he kind of fell out of favor for a long time because people, Nicole, we had that discussion in class yesterday and the other class about what is literature and all this stuff, right? But he kind of fell out because they said that he's too sensational, right? He's a little too out there. That's pretty much the main reason why, right? He's just trying to shock people for shock value's sake. That's kind of a charge that's even labeled today against a lot of stuff, right? Like sometimes that's a true claim, right? Like the Saw movies, right? You guys all know what I'm talking about. The Saw movies. Yeah, that was a horror movie franchise like 10 years ago, but there's like 8 of them. But every one of them was just trying to top the last one as far as like shock and blood and
gore.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. A really torture porn type of films as far as that goes. And that's kind of what people said about Poe for a long time, that he just isn't great literature, right? That he's just trying to shock. But over the 60s, 70s, the 80s, he started regaining his reputation. People started realizing, hey, this guy was an innovator. He did a lot of interesting stuff. Not just in the prose form, but also in poetry. You guys probably know he was also a poet. He wrote 2 of the most famous poems of the Raven, which is what Lauren was alluding to with the Baltimore Ravens. Right? His famous poems called The Raven. And Annabelle Lee, that's another one of his famous poems. So yeah, he died at a very young age as well, from presumably these issues that we're talking about. Let's see if I can get you a good.
Did his life mirror his writing and like how dark it was?
Yeah. Lots of times we talk the first day of class about author, what's the author's relationship with the text. This is Poe's oftentimes a writer that people it's worth talking about right now, but he's a writer that people oftentimes like to say, okay, we know though that he struggled with substance abuse and alcohol abuse. How else could he have written this crazy stuff that he wrote? Right? How else could you think of such stuff? That's oftentimes the what people like to argue about it, right? And I think Poe kind of invites that type of criticism on himself, like with the Black Cat. The guy in the story takes all this violence because he's an alcoholic, presumably, right? So I think Poe is even kind of cognizant of that fact, right? People know I'm messed up, so might as well play on it, right? It seemed that way to me. Yeah, he died in 1849, so he died well before the Civil War. He was only 40. Yeah, he was only 40 when he passed. This thing kind of makes me a little weary. I'm just like, I'm almost 34, right? Look what this guy did by the time he's 40, right? Kind of puts you. The guys that are in the film class. Orson Welles made Citizen Kane when he was 25, right? So sometimes these people who do accomplish such things make you question yourself, right? What am I doing? But he did all this stuff by the time he was 40, and that's when he passed. So it says that when he died, he was found senseless near a polling place in Baltimore. Right, so the post-mortem said he had congestion of the brain. That's what this post-mortem said. So probably his liver probably gave out. He probably had cirrhosis or something like that, right? That's kind of what the modernist understanding of what probably happened to him. Yeah, that's what. So you guys all know that probably based off conversations you might have had in middle school, high school. Right? I don't know if you guys, or maybe not. Maybe you learned that from somewhere else. You guys maybe remember where you've heard this stuff about Poe.
I had a friend in high school that was a very big Poe fan, and we talked about it pretty often. And also, some of my high school English classes discussed him a bit.
Right? You remember what stories you covered in high school English? I'd be curious to know.
I remember we did my freshman year. We did Annabelle Lee, The Raven, and in middle school we did The Telltale Heart. There's one more, but I cannot remember the name of it. It was a very long time ago.
You have a far better memory than me. I can't remember most of the English stories from Edgar Allan Poe. I just know he was brought up frequently in our English classes.
Right.
And I also read sequel to the Shadowhunter series has a lot of his poetry ingrained in it.
Does it?
Mm-hmm.
Like quotes, lines from the poetry, and
well, the storyline is kind of about Annabelle, sort of. Like, it's really, really interesting. It's not well written. Well, for a YA book, it's pretty good, but looking back on it, it's like meh. But the story itself is very good.
Right. So he is a writer who has influenced all other horror writers since. Right now, all writers since owe some type of debt to Poe. Stephen King, even some of the like we'll read Lovecraft here in a week or two. Lovecraft definitely owes a debt to Poe. Shirley Jackson, all the great horror writers since, they're in Poe's shadow, right? Like he's casted that wide of a net over them. And part of why is what stuff that we were talking about, we will talk about here. So question is, what's unique about Poe's stories? Why was he so influential? Well, one thing we talked about with Irving the other day was the role of the narrator. Right, the role of the narrator. Irving's narrator was that narrator in Sleepy Hollow was more complex than I remembered it. That's something we discovered the other day, right? It was kind of a third person narrator, but then he veered in the first person a couple of times. I did not remember that, so I'm glad that we discovered that the other day. I'd always thought of Irving as a third person narrator, but no, he threw a curveball. But Poe is known for his first person narrators. He never tells a story from a third person omniscient angle. Right? Of course, you guys remember the third person omniscience, the narrator that knows everything. Right? They can tell you everything about what a character's feeling or thinking or whatever. Right? Poe's narrators, or first person, and you have to ask yourself, what's the truth? What actually happened in this story? Well, that's hard to tell because his narrators are so unreliable. Right? His narrators are usually people who are crazy, people who are mentally ill. Right? They don't have. You can't really trust them to give you, the full truth as far as what happens with the story. So it's a little unsettling, right? It kind of puts you into the mind of a killer, right? In lots of these stories, it's a little unsettling in that way. That's lots of. I think that's part of the reason why people gravitate to him, right? It's titillating almost to put yourself into the mind of such people, right? That's why even now the true crime shows and whatnot are so popular, right? Everybody, lots of people were interested in serial killers and Ted Bundy and all these different things. Like that's what we have, all these shows that come out, all these documentaries about all these different killers, right? People are curious about the mind of these types of people, right?
I think a big part of that, especially with Poe, is that humans, we all sometimes have, those really dark thoughts, even if it's just like a really quick thought that's like, oh no, I would never. Hold on.
The bird.
It's like, no, I would never consider that. And then Poe just embraces it. And I think that's a big part of what The Imp of the Perverse was about, embracing those really dark desires. But in a way, he wouldn't take responsibility for it. I don't know. It was just very strange for me.
So the idea of perverseness, right? That both stories. That's why I always link these two stories together. Both these stories play off this same theme, right? This idea of perverseness. We can we'll definitely dive into that here in a second when we talk about the themes. Yeah, this idea of perverseness. So yeah, I mean, why do you guys think? Like, do you guys like this type of stuff? This true crime documentaries? Do you guys watch this type of stuff? Is this your cup of tea?
Me personally, yeah. Not really from the murderer's perspective. Like when I was reading The Black Cat, when it talked about him like doing that to those animals, it was very, very hard to read for me because I love animals. But as far as like tracking them down and finding them and bringing them to justice, I like that aspect of those kind of shows.
Right, so the hunt and the detective work that goes into finding them.
We can't.
There's something, yeah. There's something going on with your mic, I think.
Something going on with my mic?
Yeah, it's just really quiet.
You're
muffled.
Almost unhearable.
Mm-hmm.
I just need to speak up. Can you hear me better now?
A little bit. It sounds like you've got something on it or something.
Sounds like it's like muffled, like going through a laptop speaker.
Mm-hmm.
How about now?
A little bit better.
How about now?
Still the same.
Huh. This is weird. I don't know what would be happening.
We try to do some tech support here. All right, so go to your Zoom and go to your audio settings. You have to click on the Zoom thing and click on the cog wheel to go to settings, and you should be able to see audio. Should be an option that says microphone, and you can test the mic, and you can also set the volume and set it louder.
Dr. Yeager's lesson of the day on tech.
I like to think of myself as well-rounded, but sometimes no. Testing.
I've had teachers who didn't know how to use a mouse.
If you have a speaker plugged up, do you think it might have got unplugged somehow?
Now I'm using a laptop. Can you hear
Oh,
me?
there it
better.
goes.
Yeah,
It's better.
I fixed it. So good. Turn the volume up. It was like really low, so I guess that's why. That's weird though. It would suddenly act up.
I don't know why it would do that.
Well,
All right, back to the subject. When I watch documentaries, I generally like to. I'm kind of into history and science. So if I'm watching a documentary, it would have to be something around like some kind of historical artifact or something that happened. It's like when Abraham Lincoln got killed, I would like to watch a documentary of how it happened and where it happened.
right. So you're more into historical type of stuff. Lauren, are you into this type of stuff? This true crime genre?
I like watching documentaries and all that just to see how they catch them. And then also would watch something about like assassinations just to see how they planned it out. I also like Criminal Minds, but being that way, I've never seen a horror movie in my life, though.
Really?
Yes.
Right. So interesting that you're in this class then.
Yes, very.
We're not watching many films in the class. There's a couple, just a couple. So I think we're watching scarier stuff in the movies class than we are in this class. So yeah, it sounds like all of you are interested from the detective standpoint of this more than the psychology of the murderers, all this type of stuff. So yeah, so let's take a look. Let's fully dive into the black. Let's start with the Black Cat, and then we'll go with Imp of the Perverse, since both. I think Black Cat's a nice way into Imp of the Perverse. So pull it up here in my book. So breaking down this story from a literary perspective, part of the first bit of the story is his setup, right? He does so much work setting up who he is as a narrator, and part of his work is to show, hey, you can't trust me here. You cannot trust me at all to tell the truth. I'm using a textbook. Let me pull up the PDF that you guys have. So on page 4 of the PDF, page 4, this is the famous passage that where he kind of throws a wrench in, saying, hey, you cannot trust me at all. He says, he's talking about his relationship with this cat named Pluto. He says, our friendship lasted in this manner for several years, during which my general temperament and character, through the instrumentality of the fiend intemperance, had, I blush to confess it, experienced a radical alteration for the worse. I grew day by day more moody, more irritable, more regardless of the feelings of others. I suffered myself to use intemperate language to my wife. At length, I even offered her personal violence. My pets, of course, were made to feel the change in my disposition. I not only neglected, but ill-used them. For Pluto, however, I still retained sufficient regard to restrain me from maltreating him, as I made no scruple of maltreating the rabbits, the monkey, or even the dog, when by accident or through affection they came in my way. But my disease grew upon me. For what disease is like alcohol? And at length, even Pluto, who was now becoming old and consequently somewhat peevish, even Pluto began to experience the effects of my ill temper. So I bring this up because it's interesting what's happening here. All right. If you guys notice, if you really start to break down Poe's sentences here, even like the sentences he has, these sentences are not written in a very direct way. right? They're really long sentences. They're almost stream of consciousness type of sentences. Stream of consciousness wasn't a thing at his time, but he might have helped to influence that a little. His sentences will start becoming more and more fragmented, right? The more, like, if you notice there's lots of dashes as punctuation. All these dashes are kind of showing how his thoughts are almost very fragmented and going astray. He calls it intemperance. He capitalizes it with as almost he capitalizes intemperance as a proper noun, right? It's this force that's working upon him. Of course, at this time period, historically speaking, there was this quite great movement called the temperance movement, arguing that alcohol was the root of all evil in America. Right? That movement eventually succeeded in banning alcohol for a number of years during the Prohibition era, right, in the 1920s, 1930s. But at this time, this movement was starting to take off. So he's playing on this idea too, the idea that alcohol's the root of a lot of evil in the world. Right. What do you guys make of this idea of that he's blaming alcohol for his problems?
I personally like reading through the whole thing, and especially the sentence structure, as you pointed out. I think all of it makes me think of him even trying to convince himself that he's not to blame and trying to shirk off any I can't think of the word. Can't think of the word. Like, he can't own it. He cannot own that he did these things. And I get that then, they really didn't take responsibility for them. But today we can look and say, oh, even if someone does drink before they do this, it's not the alcohol's fault. It's their fault for drinking. And I think that throughout all of this, he just tried to shirk responsibility for it completely.
There's oftentimes the saying that alcohol brings out your true natures almost, right? Somebody gets really drunk and does something nasty, right? Maybe that's who they truly are, but they're sometimes just repressing themselves. Alcohol stops you from repressing yourself. All right, so maybe this guy's just naturally bad.
Mm-hmm. And even when he killed his wife, he said the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness. He just could not take responsibility for anything. And I think that the narrator, the character in that, the narrator, I think if they would have taken responsibility for it, I think they would have went into total madness.
Right. He even mentions there that he slept a very sound sleep right after he killed his wife and buried her in the wall. Right. So how could one sleep so soundly after doing something like that? Right. That's an interesting. So building off what you just said, right? That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. And he never showed remorse for killing his wife. From the moment that he did it to the very end, I think there was one part where he might have showed just a little bit, but never, I felt like never real remorse.
Yeah, this is where this idea of perverseness starts to come in, right? And so let me find it on this PDF. It's not long after this. Yeah, on the bottom of page 5, this is where we get this passage about perverseness. So he talks about how this is after he gets mad at this cat and cuts its eyeball out, right? This is before he hangs the cat by the neck, right? That's how he kills the first cat. He hangs it. He says, in the meantime, the cat slowly recovered. The socket of a lost eye presented its true frightful appearance. He no longer appeared to suffer any pain. He went about the house as usual, but as might be expected, fled in extreme terror at my approach. I had so much of my old heart left as to be at first grieved by the evident dislike on the part of a creature which had once so loved me. The feeling soon gave place to irritation, and then came, as if to my final and irrevocable overthrow, the spirit of perverseness. Of this spirit, philosophy takes no account. That I am more sure that my soul lives than I am that perverseness is one of the most primitive impulses of the human heart, one of the indivisible primary faculties or sentiments which give direction to the character of man. Who has not 100 times found himself committing a vile or a stupid action for no other reason than because he knows he should not? Have we not a perpetual inclination in the teeth of our best judgment to violate that which is law merely because we understand it to be such? This spirit of perverseness, I say, came to my final overthrow. It was this unfathomable longing of the soul to vex itself, to offer violence to its own nature, to do wrong for the wrong's sake only, that urged me to continue and finally to consummate the injury I had inflicted upon the unoffending brute. And then he goes from there. But this is this idea that he raises in both this and the other story, the imp of the perverse, like this idea of perverseness. It's not logical, right? We act in a self-destructive way just because it's self-destructive. Right? He kind of argues we're all naturally self-destructive as people. We all do stupid stuff just for the sake of doing stupid stuff. Right? What do the three of you think about this idea? Do you think that he's right about human nature in this way? Do we sometimes do stuff just for the sake of doing it, even though we know it's stupid?
In many ways, I think he is correct because I kind of do this myself, as I will. He mentions in the other story that it is within human nature to push things back to the last possible second and then try to do it all last minute.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't finish it, they will end up trying to shrink or hide away from any kind of responsibility or consequence. I can't say the word. Consequences. He tries to state this as human nature, which for many people it is, but for some it's not.
Right.
I think that this is kind of fact for most people, including myself.
Right. You know procrastination's a stupid idea, but you still do it anyway the night before that essay's due. Right. So
Yeah, just like the discussion post that I posted about 5 minutes before the class started.
I'm in the same boat. No, I agree. I agree with everything, but my view differs a little bit. I feel like, that urge to do self-destructive things is in all of us, but I think some people, and I think humans in general, what makes us conscious is that we're able to fight that urge. I think, and we have the ability to not give into it and to say, well, just because I want to, I don't have to. I think we have the power to have total autonomy over ourselves and what we do, even though we might get some intrusive thoughts sometimes.
Right. Yeah, Lauren, what do you make of this idea?
I agree with both of their statements on that because I do agree with Nicole saying that even though you have these thoughts, you don't have to go with them. But I also agree with Ryan because I am a very bad procrastinator.
Yeah. I used to be. As I survived on procrastination all the way through my doctoral dissertation, right? I realized then that you couldn't write an entire book by procrastinating the night before, right? So, and I eventually was broke of it. Yeah. So, the imp of the perverse, segueing over into that just briefly. He in the imp of the perverse, he gives more of the narrator of that story. He gives much more of a philosophical abstract lecture at the start of it. Right, the first 3 or 4 pages are nothing but this guy waxing philosophically about this idea of perverseness. But one of the images that he gives is he says, I don't know if you guys can share your stories if you want, but I know that I've done this. But he gives the illustration of you're standing over a cliff's edge, right? And you just imagine to yourself, you have this long, you just imagine yourself, what if I jumped off this cliff, right? That's kind of, that's this idea of perverseness in a nutshell, right? This self-destructive impulse that we might have. How could you explain that feeling logically, right? There's no way to explain it, right? You just imagine even if you don't really want to do it, you just imagine yourself. What if I jumped off this cliff and I'm looking down, right? So yeah, that's the image that he gives. What do you guys think of that image? Have you ever done such a thing?
I have, maybe not to that extent, but I used to go to church a lot, and I don't know why, but I just get in my head, I was like, what if I just started yelling the worst obscenities? Like, what if I just did something off the wall? And I know it might not be logical, but I think about it, and sometimes I think about, like, we're free, but we're not free to do anything at any time. Some things, if we used our freedom to do them, they would, maybe kill us or cause us major problems. And I think that being restrained in some way to do that can push us to think about them more.
Right. So the more rules that are put on us, the more we want to break them. Right. Church is nothing but rules, right? About proper conduct and behavior. I don't know. Have the rest of you been in similar predicaments? Like being in a social situation where you think, what if I did something crazy here?
I've always known about this, like walking up to a teacher and just cursing them out because they assigned me like 30,000 pages of homework and had to do the next day. Back in high school, not in college. Because that happened to me twice.
If you did that to me, I would just laugh at you, Ryan, because I know how you are. So I wouldn't even be offended.
I would be jokingly, because I don't have a reason. I haven't got one yet.
There's a novel that I like to teach called The Monkey Wrench Gang, which is about environmental eco-terrorists, right? Sabotaging equipment and stuff. But one time I gave an assignment, one of my former students, I gave some type of like discussion question about it. One former student just drew a picture of a monkey holding a wrench on his quiz, right? Being the smart ass that I am, I gave him 100 on it. That's because I had to reward his snarkiness, right? I appreciate a level of snarkiness, right? So you can get away with such things with me. I find it funny.
You're telling me for the next essay I need to draw a monkey holding a wrench and I get 100%.
Well, if we were reading the Monkey Wrench Gang, maybe. Yeah. So, Lauren, what about you? Have you had similar fantasies in a social situation like this?
If I have, I don't remember them. I don't think I have.
It's probably a good thing, right? you're not self-destructive like the other three of us are.
Sometimes, this is gonna sound bad. This is gonna sound very bad. But like, I've had them before where it's like, I really could kill somebody. Where it's like, I really could. And then I'm like, wait, you don't want to do that. You don't.
Well, it is interesting how how the society even function, right? Well, we all have this impulse. I always like to tell students, I said, teachers really don't have any power at all, right? Like, for instance, I say this essay is due Friday at 5 o'clock. Well, what if the whole class just bands together and says, fuck this, we're not doing this essay, right? What can I really do about it? Nothing, right? It would even make me look bad. I mean, I would have to fail an entire class, right? Then administration would be like, why are you failing your entire class, right? So
The real danger is the students discovering this.
exactly, right?
I discovered it in high school and I got my way on about 80% of things.
Right. It's a matter of unification. If you can unify everyone to your cause, which that's easier said than done. Right.
That's how it was last year in high school when we all went online. I don't think a single person did another piece of work as soon as we were kicked out of school. And yet everybody passed with A's or B's. There was more high honor roll students in that year than there was ever. Because nobody cared. Nobody even attempted to do a Zoom meeting if they were a senior. I know I didn't. I don't think I ever even looked at a teacher again.
That's definitely concerning, right? But,
I graduated.
definitely concerning that you had that experience. Rest of you have a similar experience last year finishing up high school.
I only went to one of my Zoom classes after the whole Corona thing happened because I had a B in the class and I was trying to get an A, but all the other ones I didn't do them anymore.
That's crazy.
I graduated in 2019 before COVID hit, so I was lucky to have a pretty normal senior year.
And last spring semester when this happened to us, like nothing really changed much at all. Right? We just went from having discussions in a classroom to discussions like this. So, yeah, it did change a lot of things up for the science faculty though, or math too. Yeah, I'm adaptable. Yeah, just think about these types of situations, right? But maybe you guys can arrange this on a math test day, right? You have a math test, everybody walks out, right? Guess no math test. Well, so that's this idea, right? Some of you are saying you've done it, so maybe he's on a little something. Sigmund Freud, the great psychologist, calls this idea the death drive. He argues that we all have. He argues that we're all have the propensity to fantasize about our own deaths, right? And this is part of our psychological nature, right? So you might fantasize to yourself, what will my funeral be like? Right? That's kind of what. So Freud takes this idea of perverseness and relates it all to death. You know, he says we have this propensity to self-destruct because we all secretly want to die. Right? That sounds a little morbid, right? But that's the great psychologist Freud, right? Who psychology owes a debt to. The first great psychologist made this claim. He argued that after the First World War, right? He saw all this death and destruction that was unparalleled in the entire history of the world, right? Hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people died in that war. More people died in one day in one battle in World War One than died in the entire American Civil War. Right? That's how big the numbers were. So that's why he came up with that theory. Right? He saw all this death and destruction, and he thought, "Damn!" Right? You know, we all have this destructive impulse, right, to the point of even death. How else could we have gotten to this extreme, like with all these dead people for no reason. So there's just it's a little psychology lesson for some of you. I don't know if you guys have heard that idea before. It's called the death drive by Freud. I don't know. Have you guys heard that before? Have you guys heard of that idea before? No.
I can't say I've never fantasized about my own death.
Right.
Never even crossed my mind.
Yeah. He claims that most people do. Right. So I don't know if I agree with that idea myself. I think the Poe perverseness idea is interesting, but I don't know if I would take it as far as Freud did. Right, saying we all long for our deaths. Yeah, but I can see why he came up with that idea, though, after seeing all this destruction and carnage during World War One, right? Unparalleled. And it was all for nothing, right? If you guys study World War One in history class, it was all for nothing, right? There was no reason why that war even had to happen. Cole says, I personally have, but it's more of a validation thing for me personally. What do you mean by that, Nicole? You wanna elaborate? She's got her mic muted at the moment. Maybe the bird is acting up. That's what I want to assume every time Nicole mutes her mic. Like the bird is saying obscene words.
She's saying stuff in the chat.
So yeah, this Black Cat story thus ends with. It ends in an interesting way. That's why I said this story is like the Telltale Heart, if you've read it before, right? This guy gets away with this murder, right? He gets away with murdering his wife. But this perverseness comes up. He wants to self-sabotage himself. So he taps his cane against the wall that he just sealed. That's got his dead wife inside, right? He does that. He confesses. He then hears the shriek of the cat inside. Evidently, the cat got locked up with the wife. All right, so he hears it shriek. And then when they open it up, the cat is sitting on the face of the wife, and it looks like it's come straight from hell. So I ask you guys this question: you guys, do you guys even think the second cat was real, or do you think that it was just a figment of the imagination of this unreliable author? What do you think?
I honestly think it was a figment of his imagination, especially whenever he tried to hit it with an axe and ended up hitting his wife instead.
Right. Yeah, it does seem convenient, right? I mean, how else? Maybe the cat's like on the floor, right? He tries to hit it. How could he hit her skull? Right. So that seems a little preposterous. Right? Ryan, what do you think? Think it's real? Or you think it's a figment of his imagination?
It's probably his conscience driving him insane. That would be my best guess, especially if he hit the skull of his wife when he is aiming at a cat that likely wasn't there.
Now, there's a curious detail here that I think supports your guys' theory. He talks about how he meets this other cat, this second cat, and he takes it home with him, like he's petting it and stuff. Then he says the next day he realizes that that cat doesn't have the eye. How could he have not realized the day before that the cat's missing an eye? Right. So that seemed a little curious. Right? He would have noticed that the cat was blind in one eye, but he didn't. So I think that supports your guys' theory that this is a figment of his imagination. There's a passage pretty close to the end of the story I want to draw your guys' attention to too. You see where it is on the PDF. Okay, it's on page 10 of the PDF. But he says this dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I'm almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I'm almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I have destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, which for a long time my reason struggled to project as fanciful, and had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shuddered to name, and for this above all I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a ghastly thing, of the gallows, old mournful and terrible engine of horror and of crime, of agony and of death. Right, so in this passage, he sees in the cat's white fur the gallows, where they hang people, right, for the death penalty. Right, so that's what he sees he sees that design within the cat's fur. Of course, that's how he killed the first cat too. Right, so again, I think that supports your guys' hypothesis as well. That it's a figment of his imagination. That also gives the story a death penalty type of theme, right? The death penalty was another movement they were arguing about. We're still arguing about it, right? Should we have the death penalty or not? Right. So the fact that he brings the death penalty up here is interesting. It's definitely a theme of the story. Can you guys think of an argument for maybe it was real? You guys entrenched in your views that it wasn't. Seem pretty entrenched, the two of you. All right. Well, the other story, we could talk about it for a second. The other story is very similar, right? Like I said, we had this philosophical dialogue about perverseness. And then we find out that this guy gets away with a perfect crime, right? He has a poisonous candle that he uses to poison the person he kills. Well, back in the 1800s, they would have had no way to tell that, right? You know, if you did a crime like that today, you could probably tell, you know, with an autopsy. 19th century medicine, you know, he didn't have such a thing. Right? So he got away with the perfect crime. But again, he self-sabotaged himself, right? He had the desire to tell on himself. He had guilt. So his guilt is a perverse instinct. In this case, because it goes against his own self-preservation, because he's going to get hanged for doing what he did. So what did you guys make of this story? Did you like this story as much as the Black Cat, or did the sort of philosophical stuff turn you off? Just your reading experience with the story.
The last story wasn't really as interesting to me as the Black Cat was. I guess this wasn't. The storyline of it just wasn't really interesting to me.
Right. Cole says she preferred Black Cat.
I prefer the Emperor of the Perverse. Now, I'm the only one that preferred the Emperor of the Perverse. And the reason I like it better is because it kind of describes how my life is. Except I'm not going to jail for something that I did. It's kind of describes things that I do now, like delaying stuff and then delaying it more and more and more and more, and try to avoid consequences at all costs, which is a general theme that goes around in this story. That's why I like it better. It just kind of resonates with me.
So you like all the philosophical dialogue about all this stuff, the scenarios that he imagines, and all this.
Yeah.
I think I'm on your side, Ryan. Black Cat's a fun story. It's definitely disturbing, right? But I just like I like philosophy type stuff anyway. So I'm talking about how human nature works and all this stuff. I think it makes for some interesting discussion. The image of looking over a cliff, right? I definitely found that interesting. So yeah, well, that seems like it's enough for today. I think you guys got the point of both stories. You see his style, especially his style. So as you read the next two stories, I assign you, ask yourself, what's going on here? How is his style progressing? What kind of tricks is he trying to pull on us? So now that you're familiar with Poe after this class, I'll be interested to hear what you think of his next two. Next two stories are a lot different. Fall of the House of Usher. Fall of the House of Usher is especially a story where you want to pay attention to setting. We didn't really talk about setting much today because it didn't seem that relevant. This was more of a character study than it was a setting playing an effect on us. So especially for next time, pay attention to setting. It plays more of an important role than it does today. Well, so we'll let you guys go. We'll see you next time. See some of you in about 15 minutes.